Mr. Walker, may I begin with you? The two gentlemen, President Trump, President Erdogan, seem to be both controversial figures, both at home and internationally. When they are meeting one another, who needs the other more?
This is a great question, especially right now in Washington, where the entire agenda has been upthrown about this Russian leak scandal. And yesterday, as President Erdogan and President Trump were meeting, the scandal only continued to grow. In some ways, the domestic politics in Washington have overshadowed any ability for Donald Trump to have a foreign policy presence. He's about to leave on a visit. And in the same way, as you've mentioned, President Erdogan, with his constitutional referendum that was much smaller and narrower a victory than we expected, both leaders in many ways need these visits to go well. But in some ways, given that Erdogan had come the furthest distance, he had the most to gain and he had the most to lose. I think in many ways, Mr. Trump is very distracted by everything else going on in Washington today.
Mr. Sakaoglu, what do you think? Do you agree with your American colleagues?
Yeah, for the most part, I do agree with him. Both Erdogan and Trump, as you said, are controversial figures, and they lack solid domestic support within their countries, like when compared with other leaders or their predecessors. So that when you see them meeting in the U.S., they need they need each other. It's obvious. They need each other in order to solidify and consolidate their position, power position.
All right. Let's see whether they have achieved that. Mr. Walker, of course, the U.S. has been controversial toward Ankara in terms of whether arming the Kurds, and for now the answer is positive. And therefore, Mr. Erdogan, how much ground did he gain this time about that?
You know, I think you're right. What's interesting about this visit was that 1 week before this visit, the U.S. administration already told the Turks, we're going to be arming the Kurds of northern Syria. This used to be a red line for the Turks. They said, if you support the Kurds of Syria, you're supporting a terrorist organization. You heard Mr. Erdogan say that in the clip you played and also at the White House. He made it very clear. Any support of the YPG or the PYD is the same as supporting the PKK, which is designated as a terrorist organization by both Turkey and Washington. But of course, Washington doesn't have very many good ideas in Syria right now. We don't seem to have a strategy in this region of the world. And so when you look at Turkey, currently it's flirting with Russia and Iran on its questions on Syria. And the question is, where does Turkey figure out how to deal with its own domestic threats, also existential threats with the PKK? While U.S. and Turkey have traditionally been aligned as NATO allies, in the short term, there seems to be a pretty big disagreement here on Syria. And so while both sides played very nice yesterday, many in Washington expected there to be a showdown. There was no showdown, but in some ways it's because of what I said earlier. Everything is being overshadowed, and I don't think Washington is paying as much attention to Turkey as Turkey would like. So what happens next? What happens in Syria? What will Turkey and what will Erdogan do? In some ways, I think Erdogan has a stronger hand to play here, given that he has troops immediately on the border, the longest border with Syria.
Well, Mr. Sakaoglu, I'm not sure about that. Should we, I mean, when you think about what is the situation there, when Washington is paralyzed when it comes to international relations, is it necessarily going to give a plus to Turkey, even though we understand at this point, Trump administration tried to arm the Kurds?
Yeah, indeed, as Turkey and the U.S. are long-term allies under the umbrella of NATO, but I think the current coalition between the Syrian Democratic Forces and the United States military is somehow of an ad hoc quality. It's a very specific coalition which is mostly directed at the liberation of Raqqa from the ISIS terrorist organization. After that, we don't know what will happen. So it's out of practical necessity rather than a long-term vision that this coalition has emerged in the first place.
What would that short-term mean?
On the other hand,
what would that short-term mean, if I could follow up, Mr. Sakaoglu? I mean, short-term, when you're making a choice, for example, your capital between Moscow and Iran and Washington, how would that short term be interpreted in this very interesting triangle relationship?
Yeah, I think what's going on in Syria nowadays, or what has been going on in that country in the past few years have been a game that's being played on very slippery slope. Alliances, hostilities are always on the shift, always changing in the short term, but in the long term and in the overall picture, I think the general lines of alignment are obvious. So Turkey and the United States have this formal alliance, and they have their disagreements as always. There have occurred crises before in their relationship in the past decades, and now this one arises as another crisis, of course. And there are disagreements that persist, but still Iran and Russia are on Assad regime's side, and Turkey is opposed to the Assad regime. So there's a clear red line. And on the other hand, the American support for the Kurdish forces in Syria was reframed actually in October 2015, when the Obama administration back then has regrouped the rebel forces there under the banner of the Syrian Democratic Forces, which the backbone of which forms the Kurdish militant groups as well still, but then they claim to be independent of the PKK terrorist organization, which they aren't, and that's the cause of disagreement for now. But I think it can be overcome in time.
Okay, Mr. Walker, it seems that your colleague from Ankara is trying to suggest that this is really a hiccup. You know, earlier some of the shall we describe as sensitive period of relations between Washington and Ankara, only a hiccup, because after all, you got this common ground against the Assad regime. Will that be strong enough? When your colleague, Mr. Sakaoglu, talking about all of the shifting relations, could that bottom line also be shifting?
You know, I think in Turkish you'd say, inshallah, Lord willing. I hope that the U.S.-Turkey relationship has been strong enough over 60 years of NATO, as he's mentioned. The problem is there's so much going on. We don't live in normal times. The fact that Mr. Erdogan had visits with Vladimir Putin, President Xi of China, and then he came to Washington is very concerning to me. He flew directly from Beijing to Washington for this meeting. I don't think in the short term there's any way for Turkey to change its orientation or its alliance structure, but I do think there's a fluidity. There's a pragmatic nature to Mr. Erdogan's leadership as he begins to look at the world. We already see it with the EU. Turkey and the EU are beyond life support at this point in time. It seems very clear to me that we will not see Turkey in the EU in the next 10 years at least. And I think the question now is, will the United States continue to rely on Turkey, or will it begin to look in other areas? And if we begin to look in other areas, it seems only natural and pragmatic that Turkey would look at in other areas. It's been flirting and trying to figure out different ways of bringing in other players, but there's no alternative.
Mr. Sakaoglu, Mr. Walker just namely said that Washington don't trust you anymore. I mean, don't trust Turkey anymore.
Yeah, could you rephrase the question?
It seems that what Mr. Walker just mentioned is that Washington, at this point, have a very little chance of 100% trust in Ankara anymore.
Yeah, I think that's right too. I think there's like the relationship is not smooth as it used to be like 5 or 10 years ago, but still, I think this Kurdish card that the United States is currently playing against Turkey to a certain extent and against other actors in the Middle East cannot be a substitute for Turkey in the long run, because the Turkish military at the end of the day has been in the region, has been actively participating in regional affairs for decades, have been actively cooperating with the US military for decades, and it's the military of an allied state. It's the second largest military in NATO still. And on the other hand, you have this militants, these guerrillas, fighting thanks to the opportunity they have found recently and the lack of authority within Syria itself. So it's no substitute. In the long run, I don't think the United States can rely on them and go on working with them instead of Turkey or against Turkey. It wouldn't suffice.
So it's a necessity, absolute. Mr. Sakaoglu?
I think the PYD is the tactical card here, but the Turkey is a strategic card, so I don't think they can be exchanged anyway.
But you know, Mr. Sakaoglu, it seems that Turkey has a lot of strategic cards. I mean, you've got the relationship with the United States, of course, President Erdogan going there trying to mend the fences. You also got President Erdogan in China earlier to attend the Belt and Road Forum, which is considered an idea started by China, but not, of course, Beijing wants everybody to join. U.S. has a delegation, not very senior level though. You also have your relations with Russia at this point. Establishment in Washington seem to not enjoy necessarily a good relationship with Moscow, even though President Trump seemed to enjoy on a personal basis. So you've got very different ways, differences between President Erdogan and President Trump.
Yeah, we got differences of opinion between them as well, as you said. But you know, again, there is this, another irony that you should not gloss out.
I love ironies.
It is
Go
that
ahead.
When Turkey, yeah, and another one, I think a more major one, concerns the relationship between Moscow and Washington pertaining to the situation of Kurds in northern Syria and Turkish intervention in the region. For instance, in late April, Turkish air forces have carried out several air strikes to northern Syria and northern Iraq. And then right after that, both US troops and Russian troops were deployed and mobilized along Turkey's southern border, along the border with Syria, to support side by side, to support the PYD forces, the Kurdish militant forces there, against any further Turkish intervention. So I think sometimes, you know, even Russia and the United States can seem to join forces against Turkey in this case.
All right.
But as I said, it's a slippery slope. Yeah, and both Trump and Erdogan are alone and they need each other. I think Erdogan needs Trump more than the other way around.
Okay.
And then whenever Putin and Trump need each other, they act together. So it's a very slippery slope and pragmatic relationship, I think.
Okay, Mr. Walker, as practical as you can get, Mr. Sakaoglu seemed to suggest anything can change at this moment. Any relations, let's not just talk about long-term strategy. It's all about the next minute necessity. Is it?
No, I do think he makes some very good points. The bottom line is I agree with his assessment, which is that Turkey needs the United States in its alliance and the United States needs Turkey. But in the short term, we have differences. And because of the domestic politics and because of the way that Erdogan and Trump are both nationalist and populist leaders, they seem to be going off script. Usually, our militaries and our alliance politics keep everything in check and we have short-term disagreements. This time it feels a little different. And I think depending on what happens on the ground, as the guest from Ankara just pointed out, there is possibility for major problems to happen. If you have a Russian airplane that's shot out of the air like it was a year ago, suddenly Turkey and Russia are looking at a very different script. If Washington is trying to back out of the region and trying to have an America First policy, it's a very different strategy than we've ever seen. Traditionally, I have a lot of faith in the U.S.-Turkey relationship. In the long run, these two countries need each other and they will be moving forward. In the short term, there are other players like Russia and Iran that could be playing mischievous games here and using the Kurds as pawns in a much larger game.
Okay.
We'll have to wait and see how that plays out in Syria.
Well, both of you gentlemen talk really fast. I guess it has to do with a lot about what is going on right now in the world. Everything is changing over the minute. But let me ask you about this. How much will the domestic constituency and politics inside Ankara and inside Washington likely to influence the next minute's decision toward one another? Mr. Walker, I really need to go with you because what you have right now in Washington is really intense. Some were even suggesting it is closer to something very dramatic, like an impeachment or something. But that, of course, is coming from the Democrats. But, Mr. Walker, what is the temperature now? What is the temperature now in Washington?
It's very hot in Washington. Many people are talking about whether Trump will be impeached. Will he be able to go on his trip? I mean, it is at a boiling point, I would say. He's been in office for only 100 and something days. It's hard to overstate how hot the temperature is and how much pressure Trump is getting, not just from Democrats now, but Republicans. If the stories about Donald Trump leaking information, it's going to be huge.
It's going to be huge. Therefore,
will those domestic politics take over foreign policy?
But that's right. You said, Mr. Walker. Therefore, how much of the decisions that President Trump makes, the kinds of friendship he's trying to establish, if we could use the quotes over there, with other international leaders, including with the Turkish leaders, likely to really translate into the real policies and actions of Washington on at least the short and a little bit midterm future, Mr. Walker?
I think in the short term, every leader right now is trying to judge how much they should value a relationship with Trump or with the United States. Normally they're the same. Right now they're a little bit different, and we're seeing that with Russia. And so I think Erdogan is trying to figure out, will a personal relationship that's warm with Trump help him on Turkey's agenda? We're not sure yet. And I think as Trump goes on his first international visit, and he will be visiting not only the Middle East, but also the G7 and also NATO, every leader is watching very carefully on this. It's not like Xi of China or Putin of Russia or even Abe of Japan or even Erdogan of Turkey. These are leaders that will be there, and they represent their countries. If you have good relations with them, you have good relations with the country. With Trump, it's a divided state here in Washington.
Therefore, Mr. Sakaoglu, how careful Turkey will have to be in terms of dealing with relations with Washington right now? You have to tread a very tight rope. You don't want to offend any of the mostly established forces now inside Washington politics. What if, right, Mr. Sakaoglu?
Yeah. I think the same situation, a similar situation at least, also applies to Turkey as well. After the last referendum, which was held in April 16th, the domestic audience or the domestic public opinion in Turkey is also as divided, at least as divided as it is in the United States. So when the United States government is carrying out any or bringing onto the table any issues or negotiating any deal with the Turkish government as well, it may have some controversial results, or how can I say it, there are some different results for different groups of people, different segments of the society within Turkey itself.
That's right.
And so this kind of controversy is not one-sided, and maybe Mr. Putin's position within Russia or Mr. Xi's position in China is very strong, and they have the public support, full public support behind them. But for the Trump administration and the Erdogan administration, I wouldn't be able to say the same thing.